the grim darkness of the far future, humanity clings to this lie with the desperation of a drowning man clutching at shadows. Across a million worlds, in hive cities that scrape against polluted skies and shrine worlds where incense chokes the air thicker than poison gas, the faithful whisper one truth above all others: the Adeptus Astartes are perfect. They are the Emperor's angels, his flawless instruments of divine will. Demigods wrapped in ceramite and contempt, standing between humanity and the endless night that seeks to devour it. They do not fear. They do not doubt. They do not fail. This is what the Imperium teaches. This is what countless billions believe as they labor in factory temples, as they march into battles they cannot comprehend, as they offer up their children to the grinding machinery of an empire that spans the stars yet understands nothing of mercy. The Space Marines are salvation incarnate. They are hope given form and fury given purpose. But perfection, like all beautiful lies, conceals rot beneath its gleaming surface. The citizens of the Imperium see only what they are permitted to see: towering giants in power armor, their weapons thundering judgment upon the alien, the heretic, the mutant. They see victory parades where Astartes walk like living monuments, silent and terrible, their very presence a sermon more powerful than any words the ecclesiarchy could conjure. They see angels, and in seeing angels, they never think to look for the wounds beneath the armor. They never think to ask what price was paid for such perfection, or whether perfection was ever truly achieved at all. There is a secret buried in the heart of the Imperium, deep beneath the layers of faith and fury, concealed behind 10,000 years of careful curation and ruthless silence. It is a secret that the Inquisition guards with executioner's zeal, that the Mechanicum encrypts in vaults that do not officially exist, that the Space Marines themselves carry in gene-coded silence, written into the very meat of their engineered bodies. The greatest horror of the Imperium is not what its enemies do to it. The greatest horror is what its heroes have always been, and what they are slowly, inevitably, becoming. The machinery of faith is vast beyond comprehension, and its gears are oiled with ignorance. On 1,000 shrine worlds, populations number in the billions, and every soul exists for a single purpose: to worship. Not to produce, not to defend, not even to truly live, merely to kneel. In the great basilicas that consume entire continents, where vaulted ceilings disappear into artificial clouds of sacred smoke, the masses gather. They press together so tightly that individuals cease to exist, becoming instead a single organism of devotion, swaying and chanting in rhythms dictated by the ecclesiarchy's hymn codes. And what do they worship? Among the golden aquilas and the towering statues of the God Emperor himself, there stand other icons. Figures cast in bronze and carved from marble quarried on worlds that died millennia ago. Space Marines. The Adeptus Astartes rendered in poses of eternal victory, bolters raised, swords thrust toward distant enemies, faces hidden behind impassive helms that reveal nothing of the warriors within. To the faithful, these statues are not mere art. They are relics. Evidence of the divine. Proof that the Emperor's protection is real, tangible, and crushingly superior to anything the darkness might conjure against it. In the Plaza of Ascending Angels on the Shrine World of Ophelia 7, 3 billion souls gather once every Terran year to witness the festival of the Crimson Covenant. For 72 hours, they neither eat nor sleep. They stand in concentric rings that radiate outward from a central dais, upon which rests a single object, a gauntlet. Crimson ceramite, scorched and cracked, recovered from a battlefield whose name has been lost to bureaucratic entropy. The priests say it belonged to a hero of the Blood Angels, a warrior who held a hive gate alone against a tyrannid swarm for 6 days before his brothers could arrive. The faithful weep to look upon it. They believe they are in the presence of holiness. None of them know that the gauntlet has been tested by the Mechanicum's finest gene writes, that its internal biomonitors recorded data during those 6 days of battle, data that showed something the ecclesiarchy chose not to share. The warrior's vitals degraded in patterns inconsistent with simple exhaustion or injury. His neurological activity spiked erratically, showing signs of stimuli that did not match external combat conditions. And in the final hours, his genetic markers began to drift, to corrupt, to express sequences that should not have been present in any Astartes gene code. The priests know this. The inquisitorial observers assigned to Ophelia 7 know this. But the 3 billion faithful in the plaza do not, and will never. Because the machinery of faith requires that some truths remain forever locked away, interred in classified archives beneath layers of clearance codes and mind wipes, guarded by servitors whose humanity was stripped away specifically so they could never accidentally speak what they have seen. Across the Imperium, in the Administratum's endless hive archives, scribes labor in conditions barely distinguishable from penal servitude. They catalog everything, every saint's relic, every battlefield shrine, every reported miracle, every whispered legend of Astartes heroism that filters up from the myriad worlds. These records are meticulous to the point of madness, filling data vaults that stretch across entire asteroids converted into storage facilities. But there are gaps. Careful gaps. Deliberate absences in the Great Record. Entire chapters whose names appear in fragmentary references, then vanish. Gene lines that terminate without explanation. Battle honors attributed to forces that, when cross-referenced, seem never to have existed in the numbers claimed. The scribes do not question these gaps. They have been trained, conditioned, lobotomized if necessary, to understand that questioning is heresy. The record is the record. If it is incomplete, that incompleteness is itself divine, a mystery of the Emperor's grand design that mortal minds need not, must not, comprehend. And so the machinery grinds on. The hymns are chanted. The statues are adorned with flowers that wilt in recycled air. The festivals proceed with their 72-hour marathons of worship. The scribes catalog miracles that may or may not have occurred, attributed to warriors who may or may not have existed, in battles whose outcomes have been edited and re-edited until truth and fiction have merged into a single, seamless narrative of inevitable imperial triumph. The perfection of the Astartes is an engineered fiction, repeated so often across so many worlds by so many voices that it has replaced reality itself. The lie has become more real than truth ever was, because truth is weak and faith is the only currency that matters in an empire perpetually on the brink of collapse. Yet beneath all of this, beneath the chants and the ceremonies, beneath the carefully curated records and the expunged data, something persists. A whisper. A doubt. A fracture in the perfect facade that no amount of ritual can fully seal. The fortress monastery of the angels resplendent occupied an entire moon, its architecture older than the Imperium itself, dating back to the grim days of the Great Crusade when such structures were built not as shrines but as weapons platforms. The monastery was a hybrid of cathedral and bunker, its spires reaching toward the void while its roots burrowed miles into the moon's crust, connecting to gene vaults and armories and sanctums where initiates were transformed into something more than human. It was considered a pilgrimage site, though pilgrims were never permitted to land. They could only observe from orbit, their void ships maintaining respectful distance while the faithful pressed against viewports to gaze upon the fortress where angels dwelt. Inside, the angels resplendent maintained their eternal vigil with a discipline that bordered on the inhuman. Every movement followed ritual. Every word spoken was either prayer, tactical communication, or silence. The chapter's apothecaries cycled through their gene vaults with clockwork precision, monitoring the sacred gene seed that made their existence possible. The chaplains led devotions that lasted hours, their voices echoing through halls where the only other sound was the hum of life support systems and the distant thunder of training chambers where battle brothers honed themselves against combat servitors and each other. Everything was perfect. Everything was as it should be. Everything was exactly as it had been for 3,000 years. Until the servitor began to malfunction. It was a small thing, initially. Servitor 734 Theta had been assigned to the chapter's reliquary, where it performed the sacred duty of maintaining the chapter's warplate, cleaning, anointing, checking every seal and joint for the slightest sign of wear. The servitor had once been human, perhaps, though so much had been removed and replaced that speculation about its original identity was meaningless. It possessed 4 arms, each tipped with specialized tools. Its eyes had been replaced with augmetic sensors. Most of its brain had been scooped out and replaced with logic engines programmed for a single purpose: maintenance. Servitors do not think. They do not remember. They exist in an eternal present, executing their programming without awareness or hesitation. This is what makes them useful. This is what makes them safe. But 734 Theta began to stutter. It happened first during the anointing of a suit of Terminator armor belonging to the chapter's 4th company. The servitor's vocalizer, which should have been producing the ritual maintenance camp programmed into its systems, instead emitted a sound that was not words, not machine code, not anything recognizable. It was a glitch, surely. A degraded vocal processor in need of replacement. The tech priest overseeing the reliquary made a note in his data logs and continued his rounds. Such things happened. Servitors wore out. They would replace the unit during the next maintenance cycle. But the next day, it happened again. And this time, amid the static and distortion, there was something that almost sounded like a name. Sarventus. The tech priest paused. Ran a diagnostic. The servitor's systems showed no critical errors. Its logic engines were functioning within acceptable parameters. Yet when it resumed its work, the muttering continued, soft and persistent, a whisper beneath the mechanical sounds of its labor. Sarventus, remember, brothers, remember. The tech priest reported the malfunction to the chapter's master of the forge, expecting an immediate order to decommission the unit. Instead, he received an instruction that puzzled him: observe, but do not yet intervene. For 3 weeks, Servitor 734 Theta continued its duties, and every day its whispers grew slightly clearer. It spoke a name, Sarventus, that appeared nowhere in the chapter's records. It muttered fragments about brothers, about oaths, about something called the undoing. Its movements became erratic, hesitating over certain pieces of armor as if recognition flickered in its augmetic brain. The battle brothers who trained in the reliquary began to notice. They said nothing, but their silences grew heavier. When the servitor whispered its incomprehensible litany, they found reasons to focus their attention elsewhere, to adjust their equipment, to attend to duties that took them to different parts of the monastery. Finally, a chaplain intervened. He stood before the servitor, his skull-faced helm impassive, and spoke a single word: cease. The servitor froze. Its 4 arms went still. Its vocalizer emitted nothing but the soft hum of standby mode. "What was your designation?" the chaplain asked, though he knew the answer. "Before the conversion." "What were you called?" The servitor should not have been able to answer. Its personality had been erased, its memories purged. But the vocalizer crackled, and in a voice that sounded almost human, almost anguished, it spoke: "Brother Sergeant Sarventus. 4th Company, gene marker corrupted, service commuted to 2. The chaplain raised his Crozius Arcanum. Blessed power crackled along its length. "The Emperor's mercy upon you," he said, and brought the weapon down. The servitor collapsed, its systems catastrophically disrupted by the power field. It twitched once, twice, then went still. Within the hour, the remains had been incinerated. The reliquary was blessed and re-sanctified. The tech priest scrubbed every system that had been connected to Servitor 734 Theta, purging any data it might have transmitted. The battle brothers who had heard its whispers were led in a rite of mental fortitude by the chaplains, prayers specifically designed to help them forget, to let the incident sink into the comfortable blur of unimportant detail. The master of the forge filed a report, encrypted with codes that ensured it would never be read by anyone below the rank of chapter master. The report consisted of 3 words: the remembering persists. In the Imperium, the narrator's voice seemed to whisper through the cold halls of the monastery, the true heresy is not rebellion. It is remembrance. But routine never lasts in the Imperium, and neither do comfortable silences. Something had been awakened in the Angel's Resplendence Fortress Monastery, something that had been sleeping beneath layers of surgical alteration and chemical conditioning. And once awakened, it would not return quietly to the dark. To become a space marine is to be unmade and remade. It is to have your humanity carefully extracted, piece by piece, and replaced with something designed for a single purpose: war. The process begins in childhood, or what passes for childhood among the populations that chapters recruit from. Boys are taken, sometimes volunteered by desperate families, sometimes simply claimed by the Astartes who need them, and subjected to trials that kill the majority before the first augmentation is ever attempted. Those who survive the trials are rewarded with the first surgery, the first implant, the first step on a path that will transform them into living weapons. There are 19 gene seed organs that must be implanted into a prospective space marine. 19 alterations to human biology, each one a controlled mutation, each one pushing the initiate further from the baseline humanity he was born into. The process takes years and kills most who attempt it. Those who survive emerge as something that can barely be called human anymore. The secondary heart. The osmodula that reinforces and fuses the skeleton. The biscopia that swells muscle tissue to inhuman density. The hemastamen that transforms blood chemistry. The Laraman cells that clot wounds almost instantly. The catalepsian node that allows a marine to remain conscious even while portions of his brain sleep. Organ after organ, each one integrated, each one tested, each one a small violence committed against the body in service of making it more than it was. But these are only the beginning. The SUSN membrane that induces suspended animation. The melanchromic organ that darkens skin in response to radiation. The oolitic kidney that filters toxins the human body was never meant to encounter. The neuroglottis that allows taste-based chemical analysis. Each implantation is accompanied by hypnoconditioning, by psychological programming, by the systematic destruction of the initiate's former identity and its replacement with absolute loyalty to the Emperor, to the chapter, to the endless war that consumes the galaxy. Memories of family fade. Names are replaced with designation numbers until the initiate earns the right to a proper Astartes name. Emotional responses are dulled, regulated, channeled entirely into useful directions: rage for battle, contempt for the enemy, brotherhood for fellow Marines. The priests of the Mechanicum who oversee these surgeries speak of them as sacred. They chant Benheric hymns as they cut, as they implant, as they stitch flesh back together around foreign organs. They speak of the gene seed as holy, as blessed, as gifts from the Emperor himself through the Primarchs who founded each legion and chapter. But in the deepest archives of the Mechanicum, in gene vaults sealed behind encryption that would take 1,000 years to break, there are records that tell a different story. Records that the Fabricator General ensures remain classified at the highest possible levels, accessible only to a handful of genitors who have proven their absolute loyalty through decades of service and mind locks that would kill them if they ever attempted to speak what they know. The gene seed is old. Older than the Imperium. Older, perhaps, than humanity's first ventures beyond Terra's atmosphere. Its origins trace back to the Emperor's laboratories during the Unification Wars, when he crafted the Primarchs, 20 demigod sons, each one a work of genetic art that pushed the boundaries of what biology could accomplish. But the Primarchs were not born. They were grown. Engineered. And the gene seed that would later create the Space Marines was derived from them, distilled from their own enhanced genetics and packaged into implantable organs that could theoretically turn any human male into a lesser echo of a Primarch's glory. Theoretically. The records, the ones sealed away where only the most trusted eyes will ever see them, tell of failures. Catastrophic failures. Gene seed that rejected hosts violently, causing mutations that turned initiates into screaming, thrashing horrors before mercy killings could be administered. Gene seed that integrated successfully but expressed unexpected traits. Psychological instabilities. Physiological deviations. Behaviors that suggested the gene seed carried more than just biological information. It carried memory. The genitors who discovered this pattern were initially dismissed. Memory could not be genetic. Knowledge required experience, required neural pathways formed through learning. It could not be coded into chromosomes and passed down through implanted organs. Yet the evidence persisted. Space Marines who had never visited certain worlds nonetheless described those worlds with uncomfortable accuracy when questioned under hypno-interrogation. Battle brothers who exhibited fighting techniques they had never been trained in, techniques that matched the styles of warriors dead for centuries. New recruits who, during their earliest surgeries, screamed names they should not have known, names of Marines who had died long before the recruits were born. The gene seed, it seemed, was not merely biological. It was archaeological. Each organ harvested from a fallen Marine and implanted into a new recruit carried with it fragments of everyone who had borne it before. Echoes of the dead, written into genetic code, inherited by those who would become the next generation of the chapter's warriors. This was not a flaw. This could not be a flaw. To admit it was a flaw would be to question the Emperor's design, and such questions led only to heresy and execution. So instead, it was reframed. The gene memory was a gift. A connection to the chapter's history. A way for the honored dead to guide their successors. But some genitors, those who studied the phenomenon most closely, began to suspect something darker. The memories were not merely informational. They were not neutral recordings of past lives. They were insistent, demanding. They shaped the personalities of those who received them, overriding aspects of the recruit's original self, replacing his thoughts with the thoughts of ghosts. A space marine, these genitors theorized, was not truly an individual. He was a composite. A flesh vessel inhabited by layers of previous warriors, their personalities compressed and blended into something that seemed unified but was in fact a cacophony of voices, all speaking in unison, all subordinated beneath the conditioning that demanded absolute loyalty and obedience. The perfect warrior, it turned out, was perfect because he had been hollowed out. His humanity was not enhanced, it was deleted, replaced with the accumulated traumas and glories of warriors who had died in service to an empire that would never mourn them as individuals, only as resources to be recycled into the next generation of angels. These findings were never officially published. The genitors who pursued them too zealously tended to suffer accidents, or were reassigned to research stations on the fringes of the galaxy where their work could be easily contained. The Mechanicum concluded, in its collective wisdom, that some knowledge served no useful function except to destabilize faith. And faith, in the end, was more valuable than truth. Yet beneath the surface, something began to stir. In the gene vaults in the surgery chambers, in the minds of the apothecaries who harvested organs from the fallen and implanted them into the new, in the whispered conversations between chapter masters during conclaves that officially never occurred, a question circulated. A question no one dared speak too loudly, but which everyone who worked closely with Gene Seed eventually confronted. If the Space Marines inherit memories of the dead, what else might they inherit? What if those memories included not just skills and knowledge, but also the conditions that led to death? What if the Gene Seed carried not only glory, but also corruption, mutation, madness, the accumulated wounds of 10,000 years of war, compressed into genetic code and passed on, generation after generation, growing worse with each recycling? What if perfection had always been a lie, and the rot had been there from the very beginning, woven into the Emperor's design? These questions had no answers. Or rather, they had answers, but the answers were classified at levels that transcended even the Inquisition's authority, locked away in archives that did not officially exist, guarded by forces that would kill entire worlds to prevent even a whisper of truth from escaping. But secrets, like all things in the Imperium, decay. And what was buried would not stay buried forever. His name was Brother Veteran Kale, and he had served the Obsidian Templars for 217 years. He had fought on 6 worlds. He had killed heretics and Xenos in numbers that exceeded counting. He had earned honors that most Marines could only aspire to, and his name was recorded in the chapter's halls alongside heroes whose deeds stretched back centuries. He should have been content. He should have been at peace within the certainty of his purpose, the absolute clarity that his conditioning and training had instilled in him. Instead, he was haunted. It began with dreams, though Astartes were not supposed to dream in the way baseline humans did. The catalepsy node allowed them to rest portions of their brain while remaining alert, cycling through partial sleep states that should not have generated the narrative hallucinations that plagued ordinary mortals. Yet Kale dreamed. And in his dreams, he was not himself. He was a boy, running through streets he did not recognize, in a city that no longer existed on any world he had visited. He was laughing, chasing someone, a brother, not in the Astartes sense, but a sibling, a child of the same parents, a relationship that should have been erased from his memory along with all other connections to his pre-Astartes life. He was screaming, watching as that brother was dragged away by recruiters wearing the Obsidian Templars' colors, watching as the boy begged and pleaded while Kale, no, not Kale, he hadn't been Kale yet, he'd been someone else, someone with a different name that echoed just beyond his ability to grasp it, stood frozen, unable to move, unable to help. He was dying, a wound in his chest leaking blood that the Laraman cells couldn't clot fast enough, staring up at a sky choked with ash while his battle brothers retreated without him because the mission parameters dictated acceptable losses and he had become acceptable. He was raging, his hands tearing at his own armor as something beneath his skin writhed and burned, as his gene seed expressed sequences that should not have been there, as his mind fragmented into screaming chaos before the mercy bolt took him in the back of the skull. These were not his memories. Kale knew this with absolute certainty. His childhood had been different, hadn't it? He had been recruited from where? The details were vague, blurred by hypnoconditioning, but he knew it hadn't been that city, that street. He had never had a brother. His family had been honored to give him to the chapter. He had gone willingly. Hadn't he? The dreams intensified. They began to bleed into his waking hours, fragmentary flashes that occurred during training exercises, during devotions, during the long watches where he stood guard in the chapter's halls and should have been thinking of nothing but vigilance. He saw faces. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Some were Astartes, their features stern and scarred. Others were baseline humans, soft and vulnerable in ways that stirred something in him that might have been protectiveness or might have been contempt, he couldn't tell anymore. The faces appeared and vanished, superimposing themselves over his vision of the present, transparent ghosts layered over reality. He heard voices. Not the vox communications of his battle brothers, but other voices, speaking languages he shouldn't have understood, discussing things he shouldn't have known about. Strategic planning for battles that had occurred before he was born. Prayers and dialects of Gothic that predated the current ecclesiarchal canon. Screams of pain from warriors dying in wars whose names had been purged from official records. And beneath all of it, a hunger. A gnawing, insistent need for something he couldn't name. It wasn't thirst or fatigue or any physical requirement. It was deeper, more fundamental. It felt like absence, like a hole in his being that grew wider with each passing year. Kale reported none of this. To speak of such things would be to invite scrutiny from the chaplains, examination by the apothecaries, possible censure or worse. Space Marines did not suffer from psychological instability. They were conditioned against it, trained to absolute mental discipline, their brains chemically regulated to prevent exactly the kind of deterioration that plagued baseline humans. But the hunger grew. One night, during meditation in his personal cell, Kale found himself speaking words he did not consciously choose. "We are dying. We have always been dying." The flesh remembers what the mind denies. His own voice startled him. He had not intended to speak. Yet the words continued, tumbling out in a rhythm that felt like prayer or confession. "I am not one. I am many. I carry the dead within me. I am built upon their bones, their thoughts, their fears, their sins. I am a tomb that walks. I am a monument to those who came before and those who will come after, and I do not know which parts of me were ever truly mine." He clamped his mouth shut, forcing silence. His hands trembled. Impossible. Space Marines did not tremble, as he tried to reassert control over himself. This was not him. This was the gene seed. This was the accumulated weight of all those who had carried these organs before him, their memories and personalities compressed into the biological imperatives that now shaped his thoughts. He was not Kale. He was a vessel wearing Kale's name, haunted by ghosts who refused to stay silent. The realization should have horrified him. Instead, it brought a strange, bitter comfort. Because if he was not truly himself, if he was simply the latest iteration of a pattern repeated endlessly across centuries, then perhaps the hunger, the dreams, the voices, perhaps none of it was his fault. Perhaps none of it could be controlled. Perhaps the rot had always been there, written into his genetics from the moment the first gene seed organ was implanted into his adolescent body. He thought of his brothers, sleeping in their cells throughout the fortress monastery. Did they suffer as he did? Did they hear voices, see faces, feel the weight of the dead pressing against the inside of their minds? Or was he uniquely cursed, his gene seed expressing a flaw that others had been spared? He would never know. Because to ask would be to speak the unspeakable, to give voice to doubts that could only lead to one conclusion, that the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's perfect angels, were anything but perfect. So instead, Brother Veteran Kale rose from his meditation, donned his armor, and walked to the training halls. He would fight servitors until exhaustion claimed him. He would drown the voices in combat, in the pure clarity of violence. He would be the warrior he had been made to be, and he would not question, would not doubt, would not allow himself to think about what it meant that he could no longer be certain where his thoughts ended and the ghosts began. But the hunger remained. And deep in the gene vaults beneath the fortress monastery, in the cold chambers where the chapter's precious gene seed was stored, similar hungers stirred in organs that should have been inert, metabolically suspended, waiting patiently for the next generation of recruits. The curse of blood and memory was patient. It had waited 10,000 years. It could wait a little longer. The fabricator locum of Genitor Enclave Sigma 7 was a being whose humanity had long since been subsumed beneath layers of augmentation and doctrinal conditioning. What remained of his organic brain floated in a sealed vault, connected to a body that was more factory than flesh, bristling with mechadendrites and analysis arrays. His name, insofar as he still possessed one, was Genitor Val. And he had just discovered something that should not exist. The order had come through standard channels, authenticated with codes that indicated inquisitorial authority, conduct a comprehensive analysis of gene seed stocks from the Sanguinary Crusaders chapter. It was routine work, the kind of audit that occurred periodically across all chapters to ensure purity standards were being maintained. Val had expected nothing unusual. The Sanguinary Crusaders were a third founding chapter with an exemplary record, their gene seed derived from the noble lineage of Sanguinius himself. They should have been pristine, their genetic heritage untainted by the millennia of war. But when Val began his analysis, deep scanning the gene seed organs at the molecular level, he found something that made even his mechanically regulated systems experience what might have been called alarm. The gene seed was corrupted. Not in the obvious ways that chaos taint manifested. There were no warp signatures, no demonic markers, nothing that would trigger standard purity protocols. But the genetic sequences themselves were wrong. They had drifted, mutated, expressed structures that deviated from the original sanguineous pattern templates stored in the Mechanicum's most sacred vaults. This should not have been possible. Gene seed was stable. It was designed to be stable, engineered by the Emperor himself to replicate without error across generations. Yet here was evidence of systematic degradation, of accumulated errors building up over centuries of harvesting and implantation. Val expanded his analysis, requesting samples from other chapters, using his inquisitorial clearance to bypass the usual restrictions. What he found was worse. Every chapter he examined showed similar patterns. The degree varied, some were nearly undetectable, others glaring, but the trend was undeniable. The gene seed was decaying. And it had been decaying from the beginning. He traced the patterns backward, extrapolating from mutation rates and genetic drift coefficients. The models he constructed painted a picture that violated every principle of Astartes theology. The Space Marines had never been perfect. Their gene seed had always carried flaws, instabilities built into the genetic architecture that expressed themselves slowly over generations. But that wasn't the worst discovery. As Val analyzed the specific mutations, he found something that defied all his understanding of genetics. The gene seed organs contained information. Not genetic information in the traditional sense, not instructions for protein synthesis or cellular development, but actual data. Memories, encoded in structures that resembled neural patterns more than DNA sequences. It was as if the gene seed had been designed not merely to transform flesh, but to preserve consciousness. To carry forward the experiences, the knowledge, the very personalities of those who had borne it before. Val's mechadendrites twitched in what might have been organic nervousness as he processed the implications. The Space Marines were not individuals. They were composite entities, flesh puppets animated by the accumulated ghosts of every warrior who had carried their gene seed organs before them. They inherited not just physical capabilities but psychological templates, layered on top of each other like data written and overwritten on degrading storage media. And like all data storage, the gene seed had limited integrity. With each cycle of harvesting and implantation, errors accumulated. The memories became corrupted, fragmented, contradictory. The psychological templates clashed with each other, creating internal conflicts that no amount of hypno-conditioning could fully suppress. The Space Marines, Val realized, were slowly going insane. Not the dramatic, explosive insanity of chaos corruption, but a slow, grinding deterioration of coherent identity. They were machines wearing out, biological engines running on parts that had been recycled too many times. He compiled his findings into a report, encrypted with the highest level codes available to him. Before transmitting it, he hesitated. The implications were catastrophic. This was not a flaw that could be fixed. This was fundamental to the Space Marines' very existence. To reveal it would be to destroy the foundation of one of the Imperium's most essential institutions. But he was a servant of the machine god and the Omnicia. He was oath-bound to seek truth and preserve knowledge. To suppress his findings would be to violate everything he believed in. Val transmitted the report. Within 6 hours, an inquisitorial kill team arrived at Genitor Enclave Sigma-7. They were efficient and thorough. Val's consciousness vault was removed from his mechanical body and transported to a facility whose location was classified even from him. His research archives were purged. His assistant genitors were mind-wiped and reassigned to duties that would never again involve gene seed analysis. The facility itself was placed under quarantine, then accidentally destroyed when a plasma reactor suffered a containment failure that vaporized the entire enclave. Officially, Genitor Val had never existed. His research had never occurred. The sanguinary Crusader's gene seed was pure and untainted, as was the gene seed of every other chapter in the Imperium. But in a vault beneath the inquisitorial fortress on Terra, Val's consciousness vault was placed alongside hundreds of others, scientists, genitors, apothecaries, even space marines themselves, anyone who had discovered the truth about the gene seed and needed to be silenced but whose knowledge was too valuable to simply destroy. They existed in suspended awareness, their thoughts slowed to glacial speeds, preserved against the day when the Imperium might finally be forced to confront what it had been denying for 10 millennia, that its angels were dying, and had been dying from the moment of their creation. The gene seed was not a gift. It was a curse. And like all curses, it would eventually demand its price. The Ordo Hereticus maintains facilities on worlds whose names do not appear on any official charts. These are places where the Imperium conducts the work that must be done but must never be acknowledged, prisons for thoughts too dangerous to think, archives for truths too terrible to admit, and disposal sites for evidence that the Imperium is anything less than the God Emperor's perfect vision made manifest. On one such nameless world, in a vault carved into the planetary mantle where tectonic pressure ensured that unauthorized access would result in crustal collapse and volcanic annihilation, the Inquisition maintained the Catalogue of Lost Brothers. The catalogue was not a single document. It was an archive spanning 3 levels, temperature-controlled and humidity-regulated, tended by servitors whose visual centers had been removed so they could never read what they maintained. Within the archive, arranged in perfect chronological order, were the records of failure. Every Space Marine chapter whose gene seed had failed. Every war band that had turned renegade not through chaos corruption but through simple genetic degradation. Every instance of mutation, madness, or collapse that the Imperium had been forced to purge from existence. There were more entries than anyone outside the highest levels of the Inquisition would believe possible. The Thunder Barons, a 4th founding chapter whose gene seed expressed psychotic aggression that eventually made them impossible to deploy alongside Imperial Guard forces. Their final campaign ended when they turned on their own allies, slaughtering 3 regiments before an orbital bombardment reduced their fortress monastery to radioactive glass. The Weeping Suns, whose Becher's gland mutated to produce not acid but a corrosive nerve toxin that affected even their own battle brothers. They lasted 600 years before the cumulative neurological damage rendered them combat ineffective. Their gene seed stocks were incinerated, their history expunged, their world renamed and resettled with populations who would never know what had once walked among them. The Crimson Wardens, who suffered progressive organ failure as their preomner stomach and multi-lung deteriorated across successive generations. Their later warriors required constant medical intervention just to survive, spending more time in apothecaria than in battle. The chapter was quietly dissolved, its remaining Marines reassigned as training cadre to successor chapters, where they would die in combat before their weakness became obvious to outsiders. Dozens more. Hundreds. A catalogue of genetic catastrophe that spanned 10,000 years, each entry a chapter whose existence had been meticulously erased from official records, leaving nothing but sanitized references to Lost in the Warp or destroyed by Xeno's action, or simply no mention at all, as if they had never existed. The pattern was undeniable to anyone who studied the catalog in its entirety. The failure rate was accelerating. In the early millennia after the Horus Heresy, chapters failed perhaps once or twice per millennium. Now, in the dark years of the 41st millennium, failures occurred with alarming frequency, sometimes multiple chapters in a single century. But the catalog itself was only part of the story. Adjacent to it, in a sealed sub-vault accessible only to Inquisitor lords with specific genetic clearances, lay a second archive, the Mechanicum's Forbidden Conclusions. These were research papers, experimental logs, and theoretical analyses produced by genitors over the millennia, each one representing knowledge that had been deemed too dangerous to release but too valuable to destroy. The papers explored questions that official doctrine did not permit. Why did gene seed degrade? Could the process be reversed? What would happen if it wasn't? One paper, authored by a janitor whose name had been redacted from even this classified document, proposed a theory that sent tremors through the handful of inquisitors who read it. The janitor had analyzed mutation patterns across multiple chapters and concluded that the degradation was not random. It followed predictable trajectories, expressing similar failure modes across gene lineages that should have been genetically distinct. The implication was devastating. The gene seed had been designed to fail. Not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably. The Space Marines were never meant to be a permanent solution. They were a temporary measure, weapons designed to last just long enough to secure the Imperium, after which they would, what? Burn out? Collapse? Devolve into something that would need to be purged? The janitor speculated that perhaps the Emperor had intended to replace them, to develop new methods of defending humanity once the Great Crusade was complete. But the heresy had interrupted those plans, and now the Imperium was trapped, dependent on warriors whose very biology was a ticking clock counting down to systemic failure. The paper concluded with a prediction: within another 5,000 years, barring some breakthrough in gene manipulation technology, every Space Marine chapter in the Imperium would experience catastrophic gene seed failure. The Adeptus Astartes would cease to exist, not through defeat in battle, but through simple biological inevitability. This paper had been filed in the Forbidden Conclusions archive 6,000 years ago. The inquisitors who oversaw the archives did not discuss what that meant. They maintained the catalog, ensured that failed chapters were properly purged and forgotten, and continued the essential work of preserving the illusion that the Space Marines were the eternal guardians humanity needed them to be. Because the alternative, admitting that the Imperium's greatest weapons were slowly dying, that there was no solution, that humanity's defenders were fighting a war they had already lost on a genetic level, was unthinkable. So they thought it anyway, in the privacy of their own minds, and continued their work with the grim determination of those who know they are maintaining a lie but understand that the lie is all that stands between the Imperium and utter despair. The purges continued. The records were maintained. The truth stayed buried. But truth, like the gene seed itself, carries memory. And what is remembered cannot be truly erased, no matter how many archives burn, no matter how many worlds are sterilized, no matter how many witnesses are silenced. The horror of the Space Marines was not that they were imperfect. It was that they had always been imperfect, and the Imperium had built its entire defensive strategy around warriors who were, by design or accident, doomed to fail. The Iron Covenant was a chapter that prided itself on stoicism. Descended from the gene line of Ferrus Manus, they embodied their Primarchus philosophy of strength through steel, logic through discipline. They did not rage like the Blood Angel's successors, did not brood like the Dark Angel's lineage, did not suffer from the overt mutations that plagued some other gene lines. They were stable, reliable, perfect exemplars of what the Adeptus Astartes should be. Until they weren't. It began in the chapter's 8th company, among the assault marines who bore the brunt of close-quarters combat. Brother Sergeant Varn started exhibiting unusual behavior during a routine training exercise. He hesitated mid-charge, his chain sword lowering as if he'd forgotten why he was fighting. When questioned by his squad leader, he responded with a sentence that made no grammatical sense, words strung together in an order that suggested neural misfiring. The apothecary diagnosed combat fatigue, unlikely in an Astartes, but not impossible after prolonged deployment. Varn was placed on light duty while his neurological chemistry was monitored. 3 days later, Brother Kaluz of the same company collapsed during morning prayers. His muscles seized, his augmented heart rate spiking to dangerous levels before his secondary heart kicked in to stabilize him. When he regained consciousness, he couldn't remember his own name. Hypnoconditioning re-established his identity within hours, but the incident was troubling. Then Brother Torian. Then Brother Mech. Then 6 more within a week. The pattern was undeniable. Something was affecting the 8th Company's battle brothers, a progressive neurological degradation that started with confusion and ended with complete identity collapse. The affected Marines could still fight, their combat reflexes remained intact, but they lost coherent personality, becoming little more than biological automatons executing training without comprehension. The chapter's master of Apothecarian conducted extensive testing. Gene seed analysis revealed abnormalities in the catalepsy node implants, the organs that regulated sleep cycles and neural activity. The organs were expressing mutations, growing additional neural pathways that interfered with normal brain function. But the mutations weren't random. They showed deliberate structure, as if the gene seed was trying to build something, to create new connections that the human brain wasn't designed to support. The apothecary filed his report with growing dread. The gene seed was attempting to assert itself, to override the Marines' original personalities with something else. The accumulated memories stored in the genetic material were trying to achieve dominance, to resurrect themselves through the living bodies of the current generation. The affected Marines were no longer individuals. They were becoming contested territory, battlegrounds where the dead fought to reclaim existence through the flesh of the living. The chapter master convened an emergency council. The options were grim. They could execute the affected brothers, purging the mutated gene seed before it spread further. They could attempt experimental treatments, though the Mechanicum's genitors offered little hope of success. Or they could report the situation to higher authorities and accept whatever judgment the Inquisition imposed. Before they could decide, the situation deteriorated catastrophically. Brother Varn, who had been the first to show symptoms, suffered a complete psychotic break during what should have been a simple maintenance task. He began screaming in a language that no one recognized, tearing at his own armor, clawing at the ports where his black carapace interfaced with the ceramite. When other Marines tried to restrain him, he fought with inhuman strength, his combat techniques shifting erratically between styles, as if multiple warriors were controlling the same body. It took a chaplain's Crozius to finally subdue him, the blessed power field disrupting whatever neural chaos was consuming his mind. In the aftermath, as Varn lay in restraints in the apothecaria, the chaplain examined the recordings of his ravings. Servitors had captured every word, and when the chaplain ran them through linguistic analysis protocols, the results chilled him. Varn had been speaking in the dialects of 17 different warriors. Not languages, dialects, specific speech patterns and idioms that matched the records of Iron Covenant brothers who had died centuries ago. He had been channeling the dead, giving voice to warriors whose gene seed he now carried, warriors who were trying to speak through him. The chaplain reported his findings. Within hours, the decision was made. The entire 8th Company was quarantined. 100 Marines, many of them veterans of centuries of service, confined to a sealed section of the fortress monastery while the chapter's leadership debated their fate. But gene seed corruption does not respect quarantine protocols. Within a month, cases appeared in the 3rd Company. Then the 7th. The degradation was spreading, jumping between companies through mechanisms no one fully understood, perhaps through training exercises where gene seed from different lineages were exposed to each other, perhaps through the chapter's own gene vaults where the organs were stored in close proximity. The Iron Covenant was dying from within, consumed by its own genetic heritage. The chapter master made his final decision with the grim certainty of someone who knows there are no good options. They would not report to the Inquisition. They would not allow their chapter's name to be struck from the records, to become another unnamed entry in some classified catalog of failures. Instead, they would seek an honorable death. The entire chapter would deploy on a penitent crusade into the Eye of Terror, where they would fight until gene seed corruption or enemy action claimed them all. They would die as warriors, not as specimens to be studied and pitted. But before they could launch their crusade, the Inquisition arrived. Someone had reported the situation, perhaps an astropathic message that leaked during routine communications, perhaps an informant within the chapter itself. It didn't matter. The Inquisition came within Deathwatch Kill Team and Grey Knight's support, forces sufficient to ensure compliance. The Iron Covenant was given a choice that wasn't really a choice: submit to quarantine and study, allow their gene seed to be harvested and analyzed, accept dissolution as a chapter, or resist, and be declared excommunicate traitores, hunted down and destroyed utterly. Chapter Master Corvin, a warrior who had served for 400 years and never known defeat, lowered his head and submitted. His chapter would die, but it would die with honor, cooperating with the authorities rather than forcing a bloody purge. The Iron Covenant was systematically dismantled. Its battle brothers were separated, their gene seed harvested under clinical conditions. Those who had not yet shown symptoms were reassigned individually to other chapters, with strict instructions that they never reveal their original allegiance. Those who were actively degrading were placed in stasis, their flesh and organs preserved for future study by genitors who might someday understand what had gone wrong. The chapter's fortress monastery was scoured clean, its gene vaults incinerated, its records seized by the Inquisition. The world it had protected was assigned a new defender. Within a year, official records showed no evidence that the Iron Covenant had ever existed. But in the minds of the surviving brothers, scattered across 100 different chapters, the memory persisted. They carried with them the knowledge that their gene seed had failed them, that the perfection they had been promised was a lie, and that they were living on borrowed time until their own genetics betrayed them. They did not speak of this. They fought and died in service to the Imperium, and when their gene seed was harvested and implanted into new recruits, they passed on not just their biological enhancements but also their silent terror, the knowledge that every space marine is a ticking time bomb, waiting for the moment when the accumulated weight of genetic degradation finally reaches critical mass. The horror that cannot speak has no words, only the wet sound of gene seed being extracted from dead flesh and prepared for the next cycle of recycling, the endless process of creating angels from the rotting tissue of those who came before. In the fortress monastery of the Death Specters, in a chamber that officially did not exist, the chapter master met with his captains in absolute secrecy. The chamber was shielded against every form of surveillance: no servitors, no autoscribes, no recording devices of any kind. What was spoken here would leave no trace except in the memories of those present. Chapter Master Vrain was 347 years old, his face a landscape of scars that told the story of centuries of war. He spoke with the weight of someone delivering a funeral oration: "Brothers, we are dying." The captains said nothing. They had known this was coming. They had seen the signs in their own companies, the subtle changes that accumulated over decades until they could no longer be ignored. "Our gene seed is failing," Vrain continued. "The degradation is slow, but it is inevitable. Each generation is weaker than the last. Each implantation has a higher failure rate. Each harvest yields fewer viable organs." He gestured, and a hololith activated, displaying data that would have resulted in exterminatus if the Inquisition ever learned it existed. Graphs showing mutation rates climbing across centuries. Projections indicating complete genetic collapse within 600 years. Comparative analyses with other chapters, showing similar patterns across multiple gene lineages. "We are not unique," Vrain said. "Every chapter faces this. Some faster, some slower, but all of us are degrading. The Space Marines are dying as a species, brothers. And we have perhaps a handful of millennia before the degradation becomes so severe that we can no longer function as a military force." Captain Ravan, master of the Third Company, spoke. "Does the Inquisition know?" "They know," Vrain confirmed. "And they have known for millennia. They maintain archives of failed chapters, they study the patterns, they attempt to slow the decay. but they have no solution. There is no cure for what we are. What we are, Captain Moros repeated slowly, is a failed experiment. Vrain nodded. The Emperor created us as weapons for his great crusade. We were never meant to be permanent. We were meant to secure the galaxy for baseline humanity, and then, I believe he intended to phase us out. To replace us with something more stable. But the heresy interrupted those plans, and now the Imperium is trapped, dependent on warriors whose very genetics doom them to extinction. The captains absorbed this in silence. They were Space Marines. They did not despair, did not surrender, did not acknowledge impossibility. But neither could they deny the evidence displayed before them. What do we do? Captain Soreth asked. Vrain's expression was grim. We do what we have always done. We fight. We serve. We die so that humanity might live. But we do so knowing the truth. We are not the Emperor's perfect angels. We are his flawed instruments, breaking slowly under the weight of 10,000 years of war. Do the new recruits need to know? Ravan asked. No, Vrain said firmly. They will learn the truth eventually, as all of us have. But let them have their certainty while they can. Let them believe in their own perfection for as long as possible. The knowledge changes nothing except to add despair to duty, and despair serves no purpose. The meeting ended with no resolution, because there was no resolution to be had. The captains returned to their companies, carried the secret with them, and continued their work of transforming young recruits into Space Marines who would inherit not just enhanced biology but also the slow genetic decay that would eventually claim them. This scene, with minor variations, had played out in hundreds of chapter councils across the Imperium. Different names, different faces, but always the same grim revelation: the Space Marines knew they were dying. The chapter masters understood that their lineages were temporary, that each generation was a step closer to catastrophic failure. But they could not speak this truth publicly. To do so would be to shatter the faith that sustained the Imperium, to reveal that humanity's greatest defenders were fundamentally flawed. So they maintained silence, creating a conspiracy not of betrayal but of necessary deception, a collective agreement to preserve the lie of Astartes' perfection even as they watched their own genetics betray them. The silence of the chapters was not cowardice. It was sacrifice of a different kind, the sacrifice of truth in service to hope, the decision to let the Imperium believe in angels even as those angels quietly prepared for their own extinction. In their fortress monasteries, in councils that officially never occurred, in conversations encrypted with codes that would trigger self-destruct protocols if intercepted, the Space Marines spoke of the unmaking, their term for the day when genetic degradation would finally reach critical mass across enough chapters that the entire Adeptus Astartes would collapse simultaneously. They did not know when it would come. Projections varied wildly, from 2,000 years to 10,000, depending on variables that no one could accurately model. But they knew it would come, as certainly as they knew that every warrior must eventually fall. And so they fought on, these dying angels, maintaining their perfect facade while the rot spread beneath their armor, written into the very organs that made them more than human. They were monuments to humanity's greatest achievement and its greatest failure, proof that even the God Emperor's designs could not escape the entropy that claimed all things in a dying galaxy. The silence persisted. The lie endured. And the chapters stood watch over an Imperium that would never know how fragile its protectors truly were. There is a theory, whispered in the deepest vaults of the Inquisition's philosophical archives, that the Emperor knew exactly what he was creating when he designed the Space Marines. That their failure was not a flaw but a feature, carefully engineered into their genetics from the beginning. The theory goes like this: the Emperor looked forward across the millennia and saw what would happen if he created permanent warriors, superhuman soldiers who would never age, never weaken, never be replaced. He saw an empire ruled by immortal tyrants, Space Marine chapters growing into their own power bases, eventually fragmenting into competing warlord domains that would tear humanity apart from within. He had already created 20 primarchs, demigod sons who were barely controllable even under his direct guidance. He had seen how easily they developed their own philosophies, their own visions that did not always align with his own. What would happen if he gave those same near-immortal warriors an entire empire to dominate? So he designed them to burn out. Not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably. The gene seed would last long enough to secure the galaxy during the Great Crusade, long enough to establish the Imperium, long enough to become so essential to humanity's survival that their eventual failure would force the Imperium to find new solutions, new defenders, new ways of protecting itself that did not depend on superhuman warriors. The Space Marines were never meant to be the permanent guardians of humanity. They were meant to be a bridge, a temporary measure spanning the gap between the age of strife and whatever was supposed to come next. But then came the heresy. Half the legions turned traitor. The Emperor himself was entombed upon the Golden Throne. The grand plan, whatever it had been, was shattered beyond reconstruction. And the Imperium was left clinging to its dying angels because there was no alternative, no next phase, no solution to replace the temporary measure that had become permanent through catastrophe. This theory has no proof. It exists in the archives as speculation, philosophical exercises by inquisitors trying to make sense of patterns they cannot otherwise explain. But those who study it find themselves confronting uncomfortable questions. If the Emperor did design the Space Marines to fail, what does that say about his vision for humanity? What were we supposed to become, once the angels burned out? And are we now trapped in a future that was never meant to exist, dependent on warriors whose expiration date has long since passed? Some inquisitors who contemplate these questions too deeply request memory wipe and reassignment. Others simply stop filing reports, their theories buried in personal archives that will die with them. Because the alternative, that the God Emperor might have intentionally created flawed protectors, that he might have planned for their failure as part of some greater design that humanity would never understand, is somehow more disturbing than simple engineering failure. It suggests that every Space Marine who has ever served, every warrior who has died believing in his own perfection, has been part of a plan that required them to be temporary. That their sacrifices were always intended to be finite, their lineages always meant to end. It transforms the Space Marines from humanity's eternal guardians into something sadder and more tragic, warriors fighting a war they were designed to lose, defending an empire against impossible odds while carrying within themselves the seeds of their own extinction, never able to speak the truth of what they are because the truth would destroy the very thing they exist to protect. The Emperor's shadow is long, and it obscures many things. Perhaps the truth of the Space Marine's nature is simply one more secret buried beneath his inscrutable design. Or perhaps there is no grand plan, no hidden wisdom, only failure that humanity has been forced to live with for so long that it has learned to call it success. Either way, the angels continue to fall. Slowly, quietly, their genetics betraying them one cell at a time, one implant at a time, one generation at a time. And the Imperium watches them fall while singing hymns of their perfection, because the lie has become more necessary than truth ever was. The chapter was called the Ashen Claws, though that name would soon be erased from every record. They were a small chapter, barely 600 Marines, defending a cluster of agri-worlds on the eastern fringe against orc incursions and occasional Tyranid scouting fleets. They had served with distinction for 800 years. Their gene seed, derived from the Raven Guard lineage, had always been temperamental. The Raven Guard's genetics were notoriously unstable, prone to mutations in the melanchromic organ that resulted in pure black skin and eyes. But the Ashen Claws had managed their gene seed carefully, maintaining strict purity standards, accepting only the strongest candidates for implantation. It wasn't enough. The collapse began during a routine combat deployment against an orc WAC. The Third Company was prosecuting a boarding action against an orc space hulk when Brother Sergeant Vekin's gene seed expressed a catastrophic mutation. His melanchromic organ didn't just darken his skin, it metastasized, spreading like cancer through his entire system, turning his internal organs black, corrupting his blood, poisoning him from within. He lasted 17 minutes after the first symptoms appeared. His squad watched helplessly as he convulsed, screamed, and finally collapsed, his enhanced biology unable to cope with the systemic failure overwhelming it. The apothecaries were baffled. This wasn't simple organ rejection or combat damage. This was the gene seed itself turning toxic, attacking the body it was meant to enhance. Within a month, 3 more Marines died identically. Then 7. Then 15. The chapter's master of the apothecarian conducted emergency testing and found the horrifying truth: the mutations weren't isolated incidents. The entire chapter's gene seed supply was corrupted, expressing lethal defects that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for some unknown trigger to activate them. Nearly 30% of the chapter's battle brothers carried the markers, and there was no way to predict when the mutations would manifest. The chapter master sent a distress signal to the Mechanicum, requesting emergency gene screening and purification protocols. The response came not from the Mechanicum, but from the Inquisition. The Ashen Claws were quarantined in their own fortress monastery. No Marines were permitted to leave. No new recruits were inducted. The chapter was effectively frozen, trapped while the Inquisition decided their fate. The decision took 3 months. When it came, it was absolute: the Ashen Claws would be dissolved. Their gene seed was irreparably corrupted and would be destroyed. The surviving Marines would be given a choice: serve as penance crusaders in the Death Watch until death claimed them, or accept the Emperor's peace immediately. There was no option to continue as a chapter. The Ashen Claws would be erased. Chapter Master Vorik, who had led his brothers for 2 centuries, received the judgment with stoic acceptance. He assembled his surviving Marines, 412 warriors, and gave them the choice. Every single one chose the Death Watch. They departed their fortress monastery in solemn procession, leaving behind their chapter colors, their heraldry, their history. They would die anonymously, as black shields serving alongside Xeno's hunting kill teams, their names recorded only in the Death Watch's sealed archives. Behind them, the fortress monastery was scoured. Every trace of the Ashen Claws was incinerated or dissolved in acid. The gene vaults were opened, and the chapter's entire genetic legacy, 800 years of carefully preserved gene seed, was destroyed in holy fire. The agri-worlds they had protected were assigned new defenders. The populations were never told what happened to their angels; they simply stopped appearing, and new warriors in different colors took their place. Within a year, the Ashen Claws existed nowhere except in the classified databases of the Inquisition. Their history, their battles, their sacrifices, all reduced to a single entry in the Catalogue of Lost Brothers: Ashen Claws. 834 years of service. Gene seed failure. Total dissolution. No successor chapter authorized. This was the unmaking. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a quiet, clinical erasure. A chapter that had served with honor for centuries simply ceased to exist, its warriors scattered, its legacy destroyed, its name forbidden. And it happened with disturbing frequency. The Ashen Claws were not unique. They were simply the latest in an endless procession of chapters that discovered their gene seed had reached terminal corruption, that the slow rot built into Astartes' genetics had finally caught up with them. The Imperium did not mourn these losses. It barely acknowledged them. Each failed chapter was replaced with new foundings, new warriors created from gene seed stocks that carried the same fundamental flaws, destined to repeat the cycle over and over, burning through generations of warriors in a futile attempt to hold back entropy. The Space Marines were not humanity's eternal guardians. They were a resource being depleted, consumed faster than it could be replenished, mining out their own genetic viability in service to an empire that had no alternative. And when the final chapter failed, when the last viable gene seed sample expressed its terminal mutation, when the unmaking finally reached its inevitable conclusion, the Imperium would find itself defenseless, guarded by legends of angels who no longer existed except as cautionary tales of hubris and failure. But that day was still distant. Distant enough that the Imperium could pretend it would never come. Distant enough that Space Marines could still fight and die believing in their own importance, never realizing they were simply the inevitable. The Ashen Claws marched to their deaths with honor. And in doing so, they exemplified the tragedy of the Adeptus Astartes, warriors who would sacrifice everything, endure anything, face any horror, accept the truth of what they were. There's a shrine on Terra, hidden deep within the Imperial Palace, accessible only to the highest echelons of the Adeptus Custodes and select members of the High Lords. It is called the Chamber of Eternal Vigil, and it contains something that most of the Imperium believes does not exist, a comprehensive record of every Space Marine chapter that has ever been founded, served, and failed. The chamber is vast, its walls lined with data crystals that glow with soft amber light. Each crystal contains the complete history of a chapter, founding date, gene seed source, battle honors, final disposition. There are thousands of them. Tens of thousands. The custodians who guard this chamber never speak of what it contains, but sometimes, in the deep watches of the Terran night, when even the palace sleeps as much as it ever does, they allow themselves to contemplate the horror preserved here. More than half of all chapters ever founded have failed. Not destroyed in battle, failed. Their gene seed corrupted, their warriors dying from within, their lineages terminated by the very genetics that made them Space Marines. The rate of failure is accelerating. In the early millennia after the heresy, a chapter might serve for 5,000 years before genetic collapse. Now, newly founded chapters are lucky to reach 2,000 years. Some fail within centuries. The math is inescapable. The Space Marines are dying faster than they can be replaced. Each new founding draws from gene seed stocks that are increasingly compromised, creating warriors who inherit not just the strengths of their predecessors but also their accumulated weaknesses. It is a death spiral, elegant and terrible in its inevitability. And yet the Imperium continues to create new chapters, continues to harvest gene seed from the fallen, continues to transform young recruits into warriors who will carry forward the same genetic legacy that doomed their predecessors. Because the alternative, admitting that the Space Marines are a failing resource and beginning to develop alternatives, would require confronting truths that the Imperium is institutionally incapable of facing. On the fortress worlds and shrine planets, the faithful still gather to worship the statues of angels. They still whisper prayers to Space Marines they believe are perfect, divine, eternal. They still offer up their children to the recruiters, believing that to become an Astartes is the highest honor imaginable. They do not know that the angels they worship are dying. They do not know that every Space Marine carries within him the seeds of his own extinction, written into the organs that make him superhuman. They do not know that the Imperium's greatest defenders are fighting a war on two fronts, one against the external enemies that seek to destroy humanity, and one against the internal enemy of their own corrupted genetics. And they will never know. Because the lie has become more important than truth. Because faith in the Adeptus Astartes is one of the few things that holds the Imperium together, one of the few certainties in a galaxy defined by horror and despair. To reveal the truth would be to shatter that faith. And so the truth remains buried, locked away in chambers like this one, guarded by warriors who understand that some secrets must be preserved forever, not because they are valuable but because they are toxic. The custodians stand their vigil. The data crystals glow in the darkness. And across the galaxy, Space Marines fight and die, never knowing that their perfection is the most grotesque lie ever told to mankind, a lie that has consumed them as surely as any enemy ever could. They are not our protectors. They are what we must never become. They are the living proof that even the God Emperor's designs carry within them the seeds of failure, that nothing in this universe is permanent, that all things, even angels, must eventually fall. But still they fight. Still they serve. Still they die in defense of an Imperium that will never truly understand what it is asking of them. Because they are Space Marines. And Space Marines do not question. They do not doubt. They do not acknowledge their own mortality or the rot that spreads through their gene seed with each passing generation. They simply fight, and die, and are harvested, and are implanted into the next generation, and the cycle continues, grinding forward with mechanical inevitability toward the day when the last viable gene seed sample finally fails and the Imperium discovers what it means to face the galaxy's horrors without angels to stand between humanity and annihilation. That day is coming. It has always been coming. And when it arrives, the Imperium will have no one to blame but itself, for building its entire defensive strategy on warriors who were designed to fail, and then lying about that failure for 10,000 years until the lie became indistinguishable from reality. The statues remain. The hymns are sung. The faithful worship. And the angels continue their slow descent into genetic oblivion, beautiful and terrible and doomed, forever. This is the secret of the Space Marines. This is the truth buried beneath ceramite and conditioning in 10 millennia of carefully maintained fiction. They are dying. They have always been dying. And in the grim darkness of the far future, there is no salvation waiting at the end, only the inevitable silence of extinction, the final unmaking of the Emperor's perfect lie.